Hello, salam, and welcome to the PalFest Podcast. I'm Bisan Ramadan talking to you from Palestine. Joining me, my amazing co-host Wahid, who is going to tune in with me today to talk about our new amazing episode. Wahid, how are you?
Hi, Bisan. It's very good to be back. What a necessary and brilliant episode, Bisan. I thought it was a very profound, important moral and political reading of Israel and Zionism. And it raised some really important points about Israeli violence and its mediation outside. Some of the conversation, as we know, goes back to Nasser's seminal essay, In Tune with Their Time. It was published last year, and I urge everyone to read it. I learned so much from this essay and the conversation, of course, because he raises some fundamental and important questions about the universality of Palestine, its loss, as he puts it, and the connection with the present moment when Israel accelerates its eliminatory drive in Gaza. And really across all occupied Palestine. Because, Bisan, I always think I've been kind of slightly uncomfortable with this, that we must not make too thick a distinction between what Israel continues to do in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine.
No, I can't agree more. And I think this conversation is going to put our audiences back to a lot of basics, but I think it will be very necessary to listen to. There's a favorite quote for me where Nasser is saying that Palestine is everywhere, not as a metaphor, but as a political subject of universal emancipation. And he draws a lot on and make the connection again back to the universality of Palestinian cause, how Palestine is important, not because it's happening in Palestine, but it's important cause for the cause in Kashmir to Guatemala. And it's like an entry point into global struggles as a wholesome. And this conversation also, like, to connect to your point, it like forces us to ask how universalism got lost and what role has the Palestinian cause played in shaping revolutionary imagination. And Nasser's point in a lot of part of this conversation is bringing us back to this core value of what the Palestinian cause means to the world, and not only to the Palestinians and Arabs.
You know, for all those who profess and practice solidarity with Palestine, that the moral rot at the heart of Zionism isn't a recent thing, or that somehow it is a stumble. I'm paraphrasing Nasser here, but that it was always there, that it is a foundational corruption, which is to say that the elimination of the native people is inherent to Zionism. It is premised on elimination, that the shift to ultra exterminatory war is an expression, it may be an expression of the frustration of the Zionist project, but the logic, the infrastructure has always been there.
And the fact that he basically focuses on the idea that some critique of Israel and Zionism comes from the fact that Israel has lost the way and we need to rectify some practices. This is also like to draw in your point of like the critique that he's trying to present to the liberal notion of how some Palestine solidarity movements function, portrayed in the critique to Zionist project, and how after the genocide it's a question of reviewing the morality of this project. So and he focuses on the fact that this is not a question of the morality, it's how the Zionist project have been implemented from day one. Wahid, do you want to tell us more about this anthology?
Palestine is Everywhere, which is part of PalFest bookshelf, is put together, edited by Sky Arundhati Thomas and Edwin Nasr, who you will hear in the conversation, has very important insights of his own. And this is an anthology of essays, poetry, photography, reportage, and letters from prison, written by PalFest author Ala Abdul Fattah, who, as we know, has just been released after 12 years in prison. So yeah, highly recommend this book to everybody.
Thank you so much for tuning with us. Your support truly shapes our ability to grow. If this conversation resonates with you, please share the episode with friends and colleagues, rate and review us, and consider supporting us on Patreon. And don't forget to subscribe to the PalFest bookshelf. It's one of the best ways to stay connected to the writers and books we are featuring here. Subscribers receive a curated reading package every 2 months, and the feedback has been incredible. people are loving discovering new voices and new words through these books. Thank you for listening, for sharing, and for being part of this community of readers and thinkers.
Very much an honor to be in conversation with you around this, because the anthology that we edited with Sky takes its name from an essay that you wrote for Radical Philosophy, and which I remember at the time really blew me away. In our editorial introduction, essentially, we had mentioned that particular sentence that you bring up, where you say that Palestine is everywhere because it names a political subject of radical universal emancipation. I found that sentence to be quite, consciously polemical, if not provocative altogether. Still to this day, I can't quite wrap my head around what the implications of such a sentence, despite it being so powerful, is to foretell. So I maybe we could start with that.
Thank you. Yeah, of course we could start with that. In a certain sense, what the Palestine question used to have and lost was precisely its connection to this kind of universality. If we kind of cast our mind back to the heyday of the Palestinian Revolution, the Palestine question played a role in which it occupied the position of the universal pretty unproblematically, in a certain sense. There's a line that gets attributed to Ghassan Kanafani. Annie Kanafani, his widow, would attribute it to him, and she would write it in the quite beautiful biography that she puts together of him, in which he says something along the lines like, Palestine is a cause for every revolutionary. It's not just a cause for the Palestinians. And so Palestine, in the sort of heyday of third worldism, of anti-colonial national liberation struggles, very much played that role in a sort of similar, analogous way to the way the Vietnam question played a certain sort of universalizing and polarizing and mobilizing role. I think part of what has happened, and part of what the essay, I think, in a way grapples with, is that over the course of the sort of denouement of this revolutionary arc, over the course of the emergence of a neoliberal global order, over the course of the emergence of a post-Cold War unipolar American order, that universalism was lost. It was lost in part also because of the denouement of the particular denouement of the Palestinian Revolution in a structure of sort of native authority in the West Bank and Gaza to a degree. So we lost that universalism. We lost its connection to left internationalism. We lost its connection to sort of discourses and traditions of anti-imperialism. The world lost it in a certain sense, because the world, and certainly the large sections of the global left were defeated, and it dissipated. And part of what I think the sort of present insights, and what it sort of reforms in a certain sense, is precisely the role that Palestine plays in much broader imperial, racial, geopolitical structures, and a sort of awareness of that, a reading. This is where the essay ends, in a certain sense, right? The essay ends with the sort of conviction that we are at a conjuncture today where Zionism stands in for every form of ethno-nationalism in the world. It stands in as a cipher for a sort of radical presentism, the closure of historical injustices, the closure of historical past, the foreclosure of anti-colonial redress. It is perhaps the principal vector, or one of the principal vectors, of fascism in the global north. And Palestine has begun to stand in its own way for a rejuvenation of this left internationalism, for a rearticulation of the imperial question, for a renewed awareness or synthesis that we see, again, also in the global north. In fact, we see it more in the global north in a certain sense than we see it in the Arab world, and that's a whole nother question. A sense in which Palestine becomes the entry point for a whole host of transversal social struggles. So it becomes there's an awareness, and there's, I think, interesting work that needs to be done here on how this compares to the Vietnam conjuncture in the 60s and 70s. But certainly, Palestine becomes a vehicle for that entry, right? This is invoked, and you can hear it invoked and incited in the slogans that are used in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. But you could see it just in the very fact that Palestine, for example, has been the vehicle in which Italian labor unions and left formations, for example, have been able to call and implement 2 general strikes. Very difficult thing to do, the general strike. You could see it in the mobilization in Spain. You can see it in the mobilization in the UK. You could see it in the student movement that happened in the US. It's crushed, but nonetheless, it happened. So I think that the return of Palestine, not simply as a sort of symbolic universal, the sort of abstract universal, an analogy, a cause, here's something, but the return of Palestine as an entry point, as a node, as an understanding of it, as a node within a broader structure, has been part of what's marked this moment. And that's part of where I wanted to end the essay on.
And speaking of the past temporality that you had mentioned, this sort of romance of revolutionary struggle that belonged to the 60s and 1970s, how would you categorize the time of the now, if you are to not present it as one of impasse and defeat? Because one other reason that Sky and myself thought that it was crucial to include that essay in the anthology was because it sort of reconciled with a form of hopefulness, in a sense. It spoke to the question of Palestine with a vitality, in a sense. And I'm wondering how you would characterize the time we find ourselves in now.
Yeah. I think a lot of people read a certain kind of hope in that essay, and maybe there is a kind of it's hard to talk about hope in a moment like this. It's hard to talk about optimism. It's nearly criminal to talk. And yet, nonetheless, there is a taking of stock, that in my reading at least, presents lines of flight. It presents ways out of things. So I think there are 2 big things that I was trying to do in the essay along these lines. One is to read the genocide, to read the conjuncture opened up by the genocide, as really not a sign of Zionism's near imminent final triumph, or simply a sign of its limitlessness as a form of state-administered mass violence. But I was trying to read it, and I'm insistent on this reading, as a sign at some level of Zionism's defeat. Not simply in the sense that, you're going to do this thing, and it was written early on, but it was clear, you're going to go so far, and everyone knows you're going to go so far that you are going to, burn yourself in the process at some level. That there is going to be a sort of nihilistic, in fact, suicidal descent of Zionism into this abyss, into, of course, the abyss that it has always been. Not only that, but also that the turn to genocide, even before it happens, is an expression of a certain kind of defeat already. What do I mean by this? I mean that it stems out of what I think of as the foundational impasse of Zionism. Zionism is sort of stuck at this foundational moment. It's stuck at a moment where it's unable to transition from the sort of foundation of order of its state to the maintenance of order, to a self-regulating, normalized state. That's why I begin the essay with this line that Israel is a defeated project. I don't mean that it's going to disappear tomorrow. I mean that in the sense that it had for itself, in the trajectory, in the sort of path that it saw itself walking on, in its ability to transition out of all of these states that it's currently in, permanent war and now protracted genocide, apartheid, spatial segregation, permanent military occupation, and an open frontier of settler violence, all of these things that are very dynamic in their own way, but that belie its transition to yet another normal state, which it claims to be, assimilated, integrated into the region and the broader world. All of these are already done at some level. And it's not the turn to the genocide that makes sure that they're done. The turn to the genocide is an expression of the fact that path is blocked. It's done. It's already a future past, right? Israel will never become a liberal, democratic state with a minority Palestinian population that it can manage through, I don't know, recognition, land acknowledgements, apologies, or it's never going to happen. It will never get to that sort of telos that it has dreamed for itself. Now, the wager might be that the world is going to go in a much sort of darker direction in which it will not have to transition to that. And that's another question. But part of what the essay wanted to get at is that the genocide stems out of this frustration. But this frustration, this sort of stuntedness, this stuckness of Zionism, the very frustration of its sort of libidinal drive, you could say, towards a kind of self-realization, is not simply the kind of imminent contradictions. It's not simply its own internal contradictions as a project. It's not simply that it arrived, late, as some people have it, after the fact of the heyday or the high noon of colonialism. This plays some role, but it's not simply that, right? Or it's not simply that this mechanism that we think of as liberal Zionism, sort of reached its own internal contradictions. There's a way in which a sort of ideology critique of Zionism tends to sort of stay contained within the terms of Zionism, within its own discursive universe, so that everything that happens seems to, go back to its own sort of its own predilections, its own structural contradictions. I don't think this is the case. So the other thing that I wanted to get at in this essay, along the lines of your question, is to recognize this as a temporality, is to recognize this as an arc, as a century of refusal and resistance that is determinant, that is decisive in its own way, right? That has blocked these pathways out for Zionism into the kind of sort of integrated, normalizing regime it seeks to be. But the big question for me here was, how do we begin to think about, in particular, the entire gamut of resistance, and as I saw it, a renewed arc in armed struggle, and what I think we need to be thinking of as a war of national liberation, and how we get around the inabilities, and I think they are inabilities at some level. I don't think they're just reluctances. They are also a reluctance, but an inability in the West, but also beyond the West, and even among, and here I'm only really thinking about the left and the sort of left liberal formations, the inability to think about that, the inability, let alone express solidarity, which is just a huge taboo for people, but to think about, rationally to think about armed struggle, its prospects, its effects, its own rationalities, its own historicity. And really that was the second big point in the essay. The big chunk is, how do we think about this? Where does this inability come from? What does it stop us from seeing? And how do we address that? How can we think past it?
I just wanted to maybe highlight this important distinction that you make, that I was thinking about while rereading the essay yesterday. I think it is important to mention that you frame Israel as a defeated project, not in moral, but in historical terms. And I think these are two very different things. And I think that a lot of people are proclaiming that Israel is a defeated project using the latter logic, and feel like distinction between both is important, and not only semantic, because one tends to erase Palestinian agency and the other is only in actuality because of the persistence of Palestinian resistance and refusal. Sure that this defeat is occurs in a sense, and I just to get your opinion on that, because I think it's a very frustrating discourse that's been running among the left, that I think is where one assumes that law is going to come in and do its work, that essentially Israel has exposed itself for all the countless evils that it has been capable of, and that somehow it will self-implode. And as spectators, we are only asked to tend to the when of the matter, not to the how.
Yeah. I think there are two important points in what you're getting at, the distinction between, say, morality and history here. One, which I think is you're right, that it's very prevalent among sort of left liberal critiques of Zionism, again in the West, but not just in the West, in which the picture we get is of somehow of an Israel that lost its way, right? That the conjuncture or the moment is really expressive of a Zionism that could have been something else, but somehow got lost, right? You could see it in Pankaj Mishra's book on the world after Gaza. You could see it in any of Adam Schatz's essays on Zionism's descent into this or that, Peter Beinart, any of these critiques of a Zionism that has now stumbled, maybe fatally stumbled, but nonetheless stumbled. And it's, it's now that there is a sort of big moral question mark about the project, as though there was something that were at some point morally salvageable about the project, right? More morally acceptable about the project. So there's that aspect of it, which is a complete complete revisionism, right? The other aspect of it, I think, which also comes through in your question, which is important, which is, well, when you look at it like that, and this is along the lines of what I was saying, when you look at it as if there's some moral stumble within the project, then you lose the causality of things, right? Then you lose the fact that, yes, there may have been something that has shifted. Absolutely, there's something that has shifted. When we argue, as I think we must, that structurally the elimination of the native people in Palestine is inherent to Zionism as a project, which it absolutely is. It is a project premised on the elimination of the native people. That doesn't mean, and this is an important point, it doesn't mean that the genocide today was inevitable. Right? There are structural tendencies that don't necessarily have to become inevitabilities. And part of what I'm trying to say is that Zionism, especially under the sort of rubric of what we call liberal Zionism, which isn't simply an ideological sort of cover, but really a form of governance, was trying, in a certain sense, precisely to proceed with the elimination of the Palestinian people without having to go down this path. Now, there is an apocalyptic, millenarian strand of Zionism that always desired this as a sort of endpoint. But the bulk of, I would say, the drive of the state, its institutions, its practitioners, its sort of cultural constructs was a means of doing this elimination by other ways, through land grabs, through slow pushing of the population out, through law and order, various means that it has at its disposal. The shift to outright exterminatory war, to the total destruction of the life world of 2 million people on live television, but also the turn to a kind of sadism, to a cruelty, to humiliation rituals, to this will to discourse, this verbose kind of incitement that's all across Israeli state and society, it has to be said, right? Which has gotten to a level in which you can listen to Israeli officials at the highest levels talking about the necessity of killing Palestinian children regularly now, right? So there's a sort of infanticidal expression that also just completely breaks any sort of repressive barrier, breaks any taboo, right? That shift is born out of the frustrations that I was talking about. That's why it's felt. I think it's felt at the level of the social body politic. It's felt libidinally. So that has to be read historically. What we need is a reading between structure, this drive to elimination that is always there, and how it shifts historically. Because elimination doesn't have to be expressed genocidally in this way. It can be implemented. Of course, the durée is longer and more staggered, but it can be implemented otherwise. The turn to outright physical exterminatory violence of the kind we've just seen in the Gaza genocide is born out of a very deep frustration. And that is not Israel morally stumbling along the way. It is Israel faced with what it regards as the sort of subhuman discards of its sovereign control that it cannot defeat. And that's the distinction here between a sort of moral reading of Israel's descent, if you will, and a historical reading of this transition, of this shift, right? It's not that The morality hasn't changed. Right? The moralism of the project, I mean, a moral critique of the project would be consistent. The project was founded on genocidal violence, right? And it's always been premised on the elimination of this people. But the tools, the instruments, the openness, the incitement, the language, the discourse, the cultural sphere, the affective discharges around it are what change. And that has to be read and sort of diagnosed historically. And any diagnosis of that historically will lead you not to Zionism's own internal contradictions. There are this mess of social cleavages and so on, or whatever, or Zionism's own ideological foundations, its birth in the crucible of, Christian anti-Semitism in Europe and the kind of ethno-nationalism that they adopted. Historically, it will take you to the thing itself, which is none of that. The thing itself is the zero-sum contradiction with Palestinian life. And when you get to that, well, you see, well, this is the motor. This is the motor of historical change here. And so that's why I think that distinction is super important between a sort of historical and a moral critique.
Then once we admit, or once we realize that Israel is a defeated project, what happens after, when the course of history, of mere history, of the ongoingness of the genocide, but also of the diplomatic gains that Israel is sort of registering in the Arab world specifically? I mean, it's funny. It's actually a funny contradiction that is at play somehow. I'm talking to you from Berlin, where I've been living the last 3 years, and here any sign of a sort of elite consensus being broken around the impunity of Israel somehow celebrated as a victory, and you see institutions changing course on the rehearsed script that they've been regurgitating ad nauseam all those years, and we see a horizon somehow within the global north of the image of Israel being tarnished or whatnot. But then you phone home in Lebanon, right? And then you read Arab media, and in fact, an entire reality altogether that's at play, right? It is one of a second, if not far more suffocating Naksa, in a sense, of Israel, in fact, gaining legitimacy, and the discourses of normalization essentially gaining traction at such an alarming speed.
I'll say this. I won't repeat too much of what I said in the beginning about the global north, because I think there is something that has shifted in the global north, and in a way it has outstripped what has happened. It's not in a way, it has far outstripped anything that has happened in the Arab world. So if one of the wagers of the resistance in Tufan al-Aqsa was a sort of mobilization of the Arab street, as they had it, in fact, as they called for, if that didn't come off, then there may have not been a wager on their behalf. It may have been, but something else paid off, which is the mobilization of people in the global north. And really, if we're being precise, the collapse of ideological Zionism at a social popular level in the north. I think ideological Zionism is dead in the West. And I think it's dead across a left-right spectrum. It's not even that it's just dead on the left or on the liberal side. It's dead as a sort of really operative ideological assemblage, the way it has been a sort of compulsory ideological formation for the very constitution of a post-war West. And I can get into that because I think that's where a lot of this comes from. I think it's dead, which does not mean, one should be very clear, does not mean that Zionism is politically dead in the West or dead as a geopolitical instrument of what we might think of as Euro-American imperial domination. It's very much still alive in those terms. But ideologically, it's dead, and that will, over time, have a huge cost. And they're very well aware of that, which is why, if you open any social media platform now, you will be inundated, flooded with Zionist propaganda, because, they have are very aware of that as a critical front in the war. Another thing to emphasize is that in a certain sense, this was precisely one of the intended effects of the genocide. And we might think about the genocide as successful in this respect, which is that the genocide, the nature of the violence, and then its mediation, and it is mediated by its perpetrators. The nature of the violence and its mediation is to instill a sense of defeat, precisely in the, if you want, the Arab subject or the Arab mind that is absorbing this, witnessing this, consuming this mediatic, which is to say that we are, the point of the genocide at some level was to create the sense of lack in this subject. In Arabic, we say al-ajiz, the inability, the lack of being able to do something, that we are going to industrially mass slaughter your children at the rate of 1 an hour of whatever it is, and you will be impotent to do anything, right? You will be unable to do anything about it. And that, of course, becomes a sort of self-reinforcing mechanism. And I think this was really one of the intended effects. I mean, if you listen to Ehud Barak talk to, there's a very telling interview he gives with an Israeli, one of these news channels right after October 7th. And the interviewer is asking him, what's the most dangerous thing about what happened? And Barak says the most dangerous thing is the spark of imagination that it might allow for. That the image that we have cultivated in the Arab world of being undefeatable, unbreakable, totally terrifying, will be broken. And that this imagination, this sense that, oh, anything's possible, right? If people in Gaza could break through this wall and carry something out like this, then anyone can do it. And I think part of the radicality of the violence was precisely to foreclose that as a potential line of flight. Right. This is not to be sort of like panglossic about the reading and to say, actually there's somehow an Arab or Palestinian victory in all of this. But I certainly don't think there is a Zionist victory in any of this. I think there is an impression of, and certainly Zionism's capacity to be sort of limitless, to transgress all norms, but that in itself does not equate to strategic victory in any meaningful way. I mean, that it took them 2 years of total obliterating, limitless, annihilatory war in Gaza, and they didn't achieve a single one of their strategic military objectives. They didn't ethnically cleanse the Strip. They didn't recolonize the northern part of the Strip. They didn't disarm Hamas or any of the resistance factions in the Strip. And they didn't return a single hostage by military force. So for all of their other sort of intelligence successes, their assassination campaigns, the sort of blows they dealt to the resistance in Lebanon, the blows they dealt to the Iranian state, the massive amounts of destruction and mass death they've administered, this in itself is not really a sort of strategic military objective that they can go back and say, well, we've closed that gap. We've sutured the wound that was opened on October 7th. We've restored our military deterrence and capability, and we are now sitting pretty again. I don't think that has happened. I think there's a sort of certain narrative that wants to present that as having happened, but I don't think a sort of any cold assessment of the reality now will yield that as a conclusion. And that's why I think we are in a sort of interim now, right? We are in a lull within a sort of broader arc and a broader temporality of protracted genocide and war that is not going to stop now, because it hasn't been settled one way or another. But this is happening at the level of narrative. For all the high sort of high impact, high visual, spectacular sort of successes they've had in assassination and bombing campaigns, I don't think the Israelis have attained the military sort of strategic goals or gains to really to enforce that as to enforce a kind of normalization as a reality. So I think we're really not done with this phase at all yet.
I mean, in the case of Lebanon, for example, they might have not achieved all of their military goals, but I think where they have succeeded is in instilling a sort of atmosphere of subservience and or fear, because I think that even beyond the media elites and what these elites want to do in terms of propagating certain normalization narratives, I think there is, even amongst the left liberal alternative in Lebanon, a total surrender to this idea that armed resistance remains a vital and important component of Lebanese society, and that Lebanese borders are protected only through the existence of such armed resistance, which I think is quite a new development in a sense. There have always been an important segment of the Lebanese left that has sort of voiced anti-Hezbollah sentiment throughout the past 20 years for different reasons. And I think in a lot of different, during a lot of different historical moments, there was reason to speak to Hezbollah as a political entity. But I think what is noteworthy now is not, whether or not how one positions themselves in regards to Hezbollah, but it's more so in regards to the idea of armed resistance, in regards to the idea of, which I think is a much more complex, and it actually even transcends, Hezbollah as an entity, right? It really questions this idea of who gave the order to enter. I don't know how you call it in English, weirdly enough. Harb al-Isnad. Is it support front? How
Support
is it?
for a support war, I guess, or a support front. Yeah.
When Hezbollah initiated its support front, it's very much like it's the ethical duty of doing such or not that has been a question within these left liberal circles that has been actually applicated and or completely rejected, which I find to be quite interesting. And it's in this that I think there is a marginal success to be noted.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and I think it definitely marks Lebanon, and it marks the conversation in Lebanon, and it's very pronounced in Lebanon because Lebanon is a very particular sort of social order, in which there's this paradox of a very powerful resistance movement, but contained within a very sectarian and very sort of fragmented social order. But nonetheless, this, the way that the genocide has been able to throw up this, or to pose this question again, a question that was in a certain sense taken for granted in the Arab world, that of course people will resist, of course there will be armed struggle against a situation like this, has been one of its, I'd agree with you, it has been one of its successes. It's done it to a degree even in Palestine, though not as successfully, and I think it's telling why it's not as successful. And that's partly because there is an understanding that for all of the risks that are involved in something like this, for all of the ramifications, for all of the consequences it will bring, there really isn't much other choice. If you look at 2 years of protracted genocide, and why were there no demonstrations against Hamas, for example, or next to none? I mean, surely cannot be because people are scared and cowed by Hamas at that point. Hamas are entirely underground. Everything's being pulverized. What ensures that Hamas and the other resistance factions remain social movements at that point, and not just governance structures or an underground guerrilla formation? The fact that they remain social movements, I think, has nothing to do with religiosity or conservatism or even the sort of alternative public spheres that they create. It has to do with the fact that there is a cumulative historical consciousness here. And the consciousness is that we have tried everything. We've tried, walking to the border and we were massacred. We've tried laying down our arms entirely in a sort of national, undoing the national liberation movement in an institutional diplomatic process, and it didn't work. We've tried everything, and the killing goes on, the dispossession goes on, the colonial machine goes on. So that this form of resistance in a place like Palestine, now there is a lot of talk about, especially in the West Bank and around people who are associated with the PA project, precisely in these terms that we were talking about and that we see in a place like Lebanon. But it doesn't resonate as much. It doesn't sort of, it doesn't land in the same way, because there is an awareness that, well, this has to be resisted by any means at some level. And there's no way out of that confrontation. And that's something that's also been lost over the last few decades, as though there were an Arab situation that could be reconciled with Zionism. And in fact, part of what the wave of sort of counter-revolutionary wars in the Arab world did was to say that there are certain places where the struggle with Zionism gets in the way of our actual emancipation struggles, right? So I think that this whole connection is something that's come to the surface again and is up for grabs. It's very much up for grabs. And I think for every person who thinks, yes, it's futile to clash with Zionism. We just, if we make our due, let the Palestinians sort it out, we make our due, we'll be fine. There are other people now who realize, actually, there is no social question, there is no social revolution in our region without a confrontation with Zionism. There is no solution to the militarization, to the frequency of war, to the sort of geopolitical dominance of everything without a confrontation of Zionism. And actually, any sort of move to deal with any of these questions has to go through that. Ghassan Kanafani used to, and the PFLP used to have a slogan in the 60s and into the 70s around the necessity of Arab revolution for Palestinian revolution, where they would say there is no non-Arab way out. Right, that is, there is no solution to the Palestinian question that does not go through the revolutionary change of the Arab world as a whole. And I think that still stands. But I think that there is today also, and one must articulate an insight around the inverse of that, which is that there is no non-Palestinian way out for the Arab world. There is no way out for the Arab world that sort of brackets the confrontation with Zionism or defers it. And I think Syria is testament to that in a certain sense, right? Because it will be there, right? The frequency, the proximity of revolution and war in our region is determined by our geographical proximity to Zionism. Nothing will happen, nothing really will change until there's a broader confrontation with Zionism. The other thing I wanted to say, to go back to the essay for a moment, is that the understanding or the sort of conviction that armed struggle is a sort of futile or counterproductive enterprise is premised on a sort of misreading of what anti-colonial war is about. It stems out of a sort of misreading of what guerrilla war is about, in which the premise or the assumption is that this is a war to militarily defeat your opponent, right? It's a war to militarily defeat your enemy here. But people are very well aware, people who have engaged in resistance movements are very well aware that the odds are very skewed. In fact, resistance movements don't emerge in spite of imbalance in odds or an imbalance in relations of force. They emerge because of an imbalance in relations of force. The premise of these wars as they're waged, this form of struggle as it's waged, which is just one among many forms of struggle, the premise of it is the opening of political space, of political possibility, right? Through a change in relations of force. It's not about, no one thinks that, guerrilla factions are going to storm and, liberate land and hold. This is not how it works. It's not how it's worked anywhere in the history of anti-colonialism. But you change relations of force as a way of opening up political possibility. And what I tried to say in the essay is that one has to understand the nature of colonial power here, which we sometimes lose sight of. One has to understand the nature of colonial power in a place like Palestine to understand its vulnerabilities. Which is to say that, like any other colonial order, it is an order premised on untouchability, on what I call in the essay a kind of non-reciprocity. Right, that I can touch you continuously at the depth of your bodily social integrity and depth, and you cannot touch me back. So I can establish a good life in my society with all of the sort of benefits that come with that, and have a frontier that is open and constantly waging. And the logic of guerrilla struggle in this case is just to disrupt that non-reciprocity, is to create a mutuality, to create a relationality where there is only one-way domination, right? This is, if you put it in a Fanonian sense, is what Fanon talks about as a sort of mutual humanization. The subhuman becomes human, and the superhuman is reduced down to the level of the sheer human or the mere human. And that's the logic. If you misunderstand that, if you think it's you have a dream of liberating Jerusalem, and you want to be a latter-day Salah ad-Din walking into, yeah, of course, I mean that's not on the cards. But that's not what the history of anti-colonial wars of national liberation have been about, right?
I've also noticed that ever since Tufan al-Aqsa, most of the writings that have grappled with the actuality of armed resistance, that have sort of engaged it on its terms beyond the pro-against logic, as if, an essay could in itself do that. Most of that writing I found to come from the US, surprisingly, even though there is, and the limits of the sayable and the limits of the doable have articulated themselves in Europe in ways that I think have led to a complete domestication of how one can and is able to speak through this actuality in ways that in the US I think are still possible. I don't know what are the historical circumstances that make it so, beyond this idea of, the ways in which the US fetishizes free speech, even though that is a complete falsity, knowing how, and Mahmoud Khalil Wujir, what ended up happening to, students and professors that have spoken out, etc. But still, it's these inner contradictions somehow they hold, in a sense. They're quite interesting to see, because it's a tradition that has been not just maintained in US left circles and that has completely been eviscerated in Europe. I do not see it happening in a single outlet. The discourse contents itself with what Francesca Albanese would somehow bring to the table, right? It's this sort of technocratic assessment of the ways in which the genocide in Gaza is bringing about a certain level of impunity that is no longer acceptable and that should be vanquished. But there's a promiscuity within intellectual production that I would only assign to the US at this present moment, which is quite funny and a little,
Yeah, that's strange. I mean, there is this I think the speech element that you put on, which becomes sort of almost a sort of a sacro religious thing in this country, although this has always been the limits of that in a very real sense, right? And the push that was made in the spring by the state here to mobilize the deportation regime against people like Mahmoud Khalil, and of course they picked people who had waited very carefully around these lines. Oster, Khalil, others who were picked up and kidnapped, who were generally much more circumspect and strategic in what they did, precisely to kind of create the chilling effects that they wanted, and precisely in a way to mobilize the entire apparatus of the deportation regime, which is a big shift. It's a qualitative shift that happened, to target dissent itself, to target speech itself, beginning with those who had status that was, from their perspective, more targetable in a certain sense, right? And I think that freaked a lot of people out, and it signaled something that was coming, right? That there would be a use of this subject, a use of essentially the sort of constitutional philo-Semitism of all of these Western post-war, post-Holocaust states, as a means of clamping down on dissent much more broadly, as a means of beginning the sort of the formations of the more unrestrained character of power that the ruling elites in the West, and especially in the States, know is necessary for the coming period. There's no way out of the poly crisis that they exist in. There's no way America is pegging China back at this stage. There's no way it's winning the war in Ukraine with Russia. There's no way it's re-establishing the primacy of its capital class. There's no way, even in AI, which was their last sacred cow, there's no way any of this is being clawed back. There's no way at the same time that there's going to be a wealth redistribution in this country that will assuage some of the extreme polarization, let alone everything that they sort of displace into border or the impending climate catastrophe. So they desire, sometimes explicitly, and this is what the ICE roundups are also about, they desire a much more unrestrained form of power. And one of the moves was to go for that, using a sort of clampdown on dissent and speech via this vehicle, right? Our protection of the Jews, which, as Alana Lenton has always said, the West's mission to save the Jews has always been about the West's mission to save the West. It is about nothing else. There's a kind of philo-Semitism that is the exact flip side of the anti-Semitism, and that has Zionism as its mediation, right? But it's always ever been about the West and its racial regimes and a salvage of its sort of civilizational identity, right? That would be salvaged in the contemporary. But I think part of what happened is that there was a pushback on this, and there was a pushback that came out of places that maybe that were a little unexpected. It came out of the judiciary to a degree, and the ruling that we got a couple of weeks ago about a few of these cases, that this won't fly legally. And so even though they've stripped the judiciary and packed it, there's still sort of pockets of very liberal procedural, hardly radical, very liberal procedural obstruction to that. But it also came out of the crumbling of the Zionist consensus on the right. And that's been a big wake-up call to the current sort of U.S. ruling regime, and the way it was trying to use, as I said, Zionism really as one of the principal vectors of American fascism. And we can clamp down on dissent, we can lock people up for writing op-eds and deport them. The pushback that has happened on the right, I don't think was expected. And it's not a moral pushback necessarily, or a political one in the sense that we would like. It's not that the right is outraged at the genocide. Maybe some of them are. I don't know. It's that the right is outraged in an age of austerity politics and in an age of extreme reaction against anything identitarian, against all the privileges of identity politics, entitlements, everything that they've bunched under that category, with DEI and wokeness as the sort of twin targets. Outraged at then this sort of backdoor entry of a kind of philo-Semitism as the one type of identity politics that actually has to be protected by the state with every exception. This is what the whole America First nonsense index is, right? Around the question of armed struggle, there's a space to push something that I think is important, and it's not like people don't understand these things. I mean, it's nonsense that somehow it's the notion of resistance, of fighting permanent military occupation and extermination and genocide is something that, people in the global north or wherever would find alien. I don't buy that, right? I mean, their entire cultural sort of sphere is premised on the consumption of these images of sort of heroism. But it's something deeper than that, I think. It's something that has to do with the sort of historical consciousness about what colonialism is today, and their sort of a large inability to think about these things in a sort of in a liberal mode. But at the same time, there are challenges one can pose to this, right? Even in very circumspect terms. Why don't people have a right to armed self-defense? Why have even the very basics of international law or multilateral UN resolutions been so easily forgotten when it comes to Palestine? These things enshrine people's legal, historical, moral right to fight foreign colonial occupation with armed force. Why does the transgression of an ethical norm or a limit, let's say an atrocity or a war crime carried out by a resistance group, why does that become the sum total of what resistance is? Why does that begin to stand in for everything? Why would that disqualify all armed resistance and that group as a whole? Since when does a war crime or an atrocity disqualify a larger nations or states or collectives right to fight, to resist against injustice? It's never been that case, right? Why does Palestine get excised so readily from its other sort of kindred histories in history in anti-colonial national liberation struggles? And one, people here can write about armed struggle in Vietnam or armed struggle in Algeria or South Africa, or even going back to what I think that is a connected kindred history in slave revolts in the Americas. But when it comes to this point, it becomes taboo, right? It becomes unsayable. You can think about the Nat Turner Rebellion, but you can never use that same frame to think about Tufan al-Aqsa, for example.
There's a much easier comparison to be made, and that's often brought up, say specifically with the German left, is that they've had a decades long standing respect and admiration for the Kurdish armed struggle, and are somehow unable to make sense of the Palestinian armed struggle. And I do think it is somehow a bit more complicated, though, than to claim that, because I think a lot of the ways in which people make sense of it is by saying that one is unable to lend credence to the Palestinian armed struggle because of its Islamist nature. But I mean, there is that, but at the same time, I mean, the FLP was widely unpopular in Europe in the 70s and 80s too, and the mantra of terrorism was brought about with, there will be reminds us, right, that in the 60s, the first anti-terrorism laws in the US were written in regards to the PFLP. So it is not a problem of Islam. It has never been.
Yes, I agree with that. I agree with you entirely. So you're absolutely right that's also a move. I think that's very important, and that needs tackling, because there is, as I said, this sort of moral disavowal, this moral critique. Oh, they did some stuff that's bad, therefore it's all has to be dismissed. And again, this is not to claim that atrocities, of course, atrocities have happened, and of course there is no an anti-colonial armed struggle without ethical limits descends into something that it is not. But there is the other point that you're talking about, which is which masquerades, you're absolutely right, as a kind of ideology critique, right? And it's because they're Islamists. It's Islamists that are leading the struggle now, therefore we can have nothing to do with it, which on face value, as you said, breaks down, because historical memory should tell us that even when it wasn't Islamist, it was disavowed. But even if you dig into it a little bit deeper today in the contemporary, you find that it's paper thin. And in a certain sense, what happens in those critiques is that they begin to substitute Islamism in a very broad, generic sense, or Islamofascism in the kind of Žižekian, the kind of tradition of Žižek and his acolytes, for the thing itself, right? So people fighting against, for liberation, fighting against the war of extermination in Palestine, Islamism becomes the content of that fight, right? Islamism becomes both what they aim for, what motivates them. It becomes the end all and be all of everything. And then you have a broad sweep, of course, because Islamism is not a coherent ideology any more than something called nationalism is, right? It's totally empty signifier that they can catch and they can use very sort of effectively and sort of very rotely as a way of dismissing that entire struggle as a whole, right? And this happens across the left and the global. Even minds as sort of keen as Badiou. I mean, Žižek is a prime example of this, but people like Badiou, who I respect much more than Žižek, will say, yeah, when it comes to the current resistance factions, well, I can't have anything to do with them. I have much more affinity with the secular left that preceded them. So it kind of confuses a national liberation struggle for the forms, the sort of political and symbolic and subjective forms that it takes. But the content is the same, actually, because the contradiction is the same. Well, you're fighting the same exact thing. And I think that becomes a means of simply disavowing the struggle as a whole, because the deeper question here is about who gets to use force to change reality. And I think the dismissal of the Islamism of resistance factions becomes a means of sort of not saying that my problem is with the very premise that these people might use force to change their position, to change the kind of status quo. And this is this, in a certain sense, it's a very long-standing hesitation and inability. And there's a sort of brilliant essay in a book by a historian called Michel Rolf-Troyot. It's a book called Silencing the Past, where he says that the revolution posed a sort of ideological but also an epistemic limit for liberal Western thought. The notion of a black slave revolt that might be emancipatory, that might even be a revolution, was unthinkable for the liberal mind of the time, right? And he says it's not simply that it was the slaves taking the initiative to free themselves, because abolition was always going to come from the liberal class to the slaves, but it was the means by which they did so. It was the use of force to do so. That was just unthinkable, right? Gregoire, one of the friends of the Society of the Black, said, giving rights to those who are not yet ready for rights would be like putting a sword in the hand of a madman, which is exactly what he thought about the slave revolt, right? So they send, Brissot will send like 7,000 troops to quash it, and history will take off from there. But even though we live in very different historical times where these things shouldn't be impossible to think, and the history of 20th century decolonization should have put an end to that, so many of these same presuppositions, assumptions that people like Brissot and that whole class had are still very prevalent, right? This sort of paternalizing evolutionary thought, the moral disavowal of anti-colonial violence, that kind of recoil, the sense that people are not quite ready to take power into their own hands. All of these things are still very prevalent in the sort of left liberal reception and critique of armed struggle in a place like Palestine. And this has become abundantly clear across these 2 years. So there is something in there's something that persists there in the sort of close guarding of who has the capacity to actually change things. Who can do it? It's one thing to say, I believe in, the end of the occupation and a free Palestinian state, or however they put it. It's another to say, I believe and I support in people's rights to do that by means of force if necessary. It becomes a sort of obstacle. And I think you're right. It has a lot to do. It will inhabit this sort of ideology critique. It will inhabit moral critique on the one hand. And it will inhabit ideology critique on the other.
But if it will inhabit moral critique on the one hand, and then ideology critique, and then both appear as smoke screens, where do you think foundationally the problem lies then? In the fact that, and you're using your own words, in the fact that, I don't know, mutuality appears to be like an existential threat for the liberal subject, for the Western liberal subject?
I think at some level there is still an investment in a sort of authorship of history that it comes out, of course, especially around Zionism. It could be tolerated elsewhere, but there is the blockage also has to do with the particular place and role that Zionism plays in the formation, as I said, and we can get into this because it's a big subject, in the formation of a post-war sense of Western civilization, right? The West, Euro-America, as something that is going to reconstitute itself after the horrors of the Holocaust, and of course after the horrors of colonialism, but in very different ways, with one at the expense of the other. Zionism is integral to the West as West in the contemporary sense, right? And this is why the cleavages are so difficult. But so I think the moral critique and the ideology critique are disavowal of both these subjects being the authorship of their own liberation, i.e., Palestinians that maybe don't look or sound like us, that maybe espouse a sort of Islamism, that talk in the language of martyrdom, that talk in the language of sacrifice, that is just going to sort of like clash with our very sensibilities, that freaks us out at some level, and with how the management of Zionism's place in the constitution of Western civilization, the constitution of the West's own self-image, is going to go. So what is that? If as Jody Dean puts it, and from the article I took a lot from for this piece, if she puts it, if as she puts it, there is no theory of change in a place like Palestine that is entirely premised on nonviolence, because the order doesn't rest on legitimacy. You can't civic struggle your way out of it. And if, as Raoul Rao puts it in another excellent essay, if no colonial or settler colonial situation has ever been changed without a recourse to violence and force, then what we're dealing with is a kind of liberal fantasy that demands a kind of analysis. So, I think Rao's point that, well, then this becomes a liberal fantasy that demands a kind of analysis is telling. What is this liberal fantasy? The liberal fantasy, I think, will go back to, in a way, it goes back to Brissot and the Girondins, is that, there will be a form of change here that we manage, actually. There would be a form of change here that is in line with what we understand to be the way things should change. I don't really have another way of understanding that, other than to say, no, this is not how it's going to change. We will decide when and where and how it changes, and you will not have the means to change your own reality by force. And I think, I don't know. I don't know that kind of logic, that kind of presentism, that kind of sort of jealous possessiveness will translate to every context. I mean, I think the Kurdish question is interesting that you brought, because no one really has a problem with Kurdish armed struggle. In which case, then the question is not, it's not armed struggle per se, right? The question is armed struggle in Palestine. And that, I think, then will necessarily bring up the Zionism, Europe's Jewish question, the great historical displacement and hoodwink that the entire post-war order, in a certain sense, is premised on.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. There's the anxious attachment to the question of Zionism, which is still, like Laudon says it beautifully, where he says that Israel is and will always be, for the post-war liberal subject in Europe, a project premised on ontological innocence, whatever it does. Right? And so in order to undo your front first, this is the only way for you to be able to actually not speak through a disavowal, because it's an anxious attachment in itself, dictates the order at which you're going to engage with the Palestinian armed struggle.
Yeah, of course. So it has to do with Zionism's quarantine, and the quarantine that Zionism puts the entire Palestinian question in. Only thing I would add to that is that it is both the ontological innocence of the a priori ontological innocence of Israel, which has been diagnosed quite brilliantly by a lot of people, in the sense that it will everything it will always do will always already be in self-defense, even up to and including genocide. But it is also about the sort of salvaged innocence of the West. And I think that's where Zionism plays a very decisive and determinant role that one has to grapple with. That the project of a sort of liberal self-redemption after the Holocaust and after colonialism, the project by which 20th century history could be read as a sort of progressive arc that goes up, has one little hiccup, which is the Holocaust and Nazi fascism, that is then self-corrected by Western liberals themselves and then keeps going up, requires Zionism, right? Zionism is the lever. It's the mechanism that allows that arc to go back upwards, right? Because Zionism becomes the name for a sort of a redemption, right? But of course, it's a redemption at someone else's expense. But what's also important about it, and I think which gets missed, is that it's a redemption that also allows a sort of extension of Europe's fundamental racial structures. This is what I think is really kind of missed. We often understand it as simply a sort of displacement of guilt or shame, neither of which I see very present in Europe or even German society, to be perfectly honest. But what is missed is that Zionism and the sort of philo-Semitism that comes with it becomes a means actually of reproducing a certain form of racial regime, right? A racial regime in which whiteness is absolved again. How is whiteness absolved? Well, because, interwar fascism was this internal aberration that we ourselves fixed. And today, this totally exceptional, unique example of racial violence that has been fixed really has its current coordinates, maybe even its historical roots in the Muslim Arab world, in Black liberation struggles in the global South, which is what the entirety of the new anti-Semitism discourse is really about. And the new anti-Semitism discourse that really emerges, not coincidentally, at the end of the 1960s, works to do this, and it becomes integral to how Europe and America construct themselves in this period.
And it rests on quite the hilarious, revisionist reconstruction of this supposed Judeo-Christian values as that never existed and will never exist somehow, but that is somehow being touted as a constant and as a historical verity somehow.
Yeah, of course. One of the functions of the Judeo-Christian notion is to displace precisely the Western Christian roots of anti-Semitism in Europe, right? That becomes displaced in some sort of pan-Protestant, quasi-evangelical notion of the Judeo-Christian. It's gibberish. But what I think is important to emphasize here is that the new anti-Semitism discourse not only sort of displaces the sort of European roots of anti-Semitism, but it makes the contemporary problem of anti-Semitism almost exclusively a problem of the left and a problem principally of sort of Arab and Muslim and particularly Palestinian peoples, right? This is the context in which someone like Netanyahu can go around Europe and make the argument that the Nazi final solution was actually the idea of a Palestinian cleric called Amin Husseini who went to Nazi Germany and gave Hitler the idea. Now, it's bunk. It's complete bunk on face value and gets ridiculed as such. But at some level, it operates as a speech act because the epistemic environment for it has already been established by this discourse.
It is also a very prominent argument amongst the German left, by the way. It is not something that only a loony like Netanyahu would proclaim at this whole.
Yeah, I'm sure. That doesn't surprise me to hear. It doesn't surprise me to hear. That's why I'm saying it operates as a speech act. I mean, historians might laugh at it, but as a speech act, it works. It does something. It has an effect precisely because that epistemic environment has already been. And the point I want to add to
of absolvement for them as well, right?
Yes, this is the point. But this is the point I want to add, that it is absolvement at some level, but it is more than that. It is also the extension of racial structure and racial hierarchy. It's not simply that I don't believe that's like racism in Germany or historic anti-Semitism simply gets sort of absolved or displaced. There is some of that, but actually Zionism is a proxy for German racism. It becomes a proxy for the extension of sort of racial structure and racial hierarchy, right? Sometimes in very explicit ways. Think about the sort of the question they had in migration tests in Germany for predominantly Muslim populations that were coming in, which had to avow a belief in the state of Israel's right to exist as a process of, I don't know, either citizenship or whatever, asylum seeking or whatever it was. So there you're using an explicit Zionism, right, as a modes of disciplining and managing the racialized, predominantly sort of Muslim populations that you are sort of disciplining into a sort of racial hierarchy. So Zionism becomes a means of you extending a form of racialization and a racial regime. It's the Muslims that have an anti-Semitism question. Merz will say this quite explicitly. We have an imported anti-Semitism problem. Yeah, Germany needed to import anti-Semitism to have an anti-Semitism problem. I mean, it's parody at face value. But this is why I say there's more than sort of absolution or displacement in it. There's an extension of racial structure, a reproduction of racial structure in new form, all right? In this sort of shifting racial regime. Racial regimes are fungible, they change. I mean, these are very old mechanisms in the Euro-American colonial playbook at some level, right? Saving white men, saving brown women from brown men is really it's a kind of formation that has many lives. It becomes, saving sexual minorities, whatever, and the other aspect, which is, the religious minorities that need protection from the Muslim hordes and masses in the Arab world, which was one of the primary mechanisms of the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire and eventually the sort of colonization of the Mashriq in the Arab world. These are sort of time-tested sort of mechanisms. But I think, they take a particular character. They take a particular character after the Holocaust and after the end of large-scale formal colonization in the world. And they take a particular character with the emergence of the new anti-Semitism discourse, which is really coterminous with the emergence of a new left and a new wave of sort of global internationalism and anti-imperialism, and really emerges to close that down in a very real sense. So there is a sense in which Zionism and its sort of Western philo-Semitisms become a means for Euro-America both to sort of extend and reproduce these racial structures and to foreclose any sort of reckoning with colonial history. Right? How can we do a kind of decolonization without decolonization? Well, eventually, as the challenge increases in the 60s and 70s, you have the new international economic order, you have all kinds of demands from the global south. One of the mechanisms, there are many different mechanisms. One of the mechanisms becomes a Zionism that says, well, we're not going to do this because it's, first of all, incomparable to the Holocaust and what happened, and we're paying our reparations there. But second of all, because all of these movements that are making these claims are fundamentally anti-Semitic. They exist in this as the progenitors and vehicles of a new anti-Semitism, and therefore we are going to foreclose any sort of redress. So really, this is why I've made the case that Zionism is bigger than the Israeli state project for the West. And this is why, even as it ideologically collapses, I think it will remain politically salient, because at some level, Zionism is hardwired into how the West, and I mean the West here as a sort of semi-mythic but nonetheless real construct, civilizational, moral, but also implicitly racial, it's integral to how the West recreated itself at some point in a way that foreclosed any sort of redress or reckoning with colonial history. And I think that will take a lot of disentangling. And to go back to the point about armed struggle that we sort of began this foray with, the aversion to the prospect, at least part of the aversion to the prospect of armed struggle in a place like Palestine, has to do with that hang-up. Well, what will become of us if these structures really collapse? And I think I should leave it there.